Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you once more for stopping by. I hope the week has gone well. I'd like to thank Kiprono Kitoni for lunch yesterday at the Tiger Club, which is still very charming, and I must get my membership sorted out there, frankly. I thoroughly enjoyed Hannah's school musical yesterday called Big Mama, which was about an elephant that ends up in a zoo because of poachers. And it really was very good. I'll put up a photograph of it. Most enjoyable. Of course, Dr. Ceci Berra, more than 2 years ago at a previous Mindspeak session, said this is Africa's century. I'm looking forward to hosting him tomorrow at Mindspeak at the Intercontinental Nairobi. We serve breakfast from 9:30. We start at 10. I'm going to put up a link of Dr. Ceci Berra from Wikipedia, a physician, politician, diplomat, civil servant, current Secretary General of the EAC, appointed to that position on the 19th of April 2011. And on that day he said, "I'm committed to work for the East African people. It makes me very proud and courageous." So he's going to be a fascinating guest. He's had a cockpit view of the whole community. And intra-EAC trade has been rising since 2002, since the launch of the customs union and subsequently the common market. Intra-EAC trade has increased from about $2 billion in 2005 to $5.5 billion in 2012. There's a link for What is Mindspeak, which was an explanation I gave to Madame Lagarde when she was my guest on January the 6th. We hold it at the Intercontinental Nairobi, and I'm very much looking forward to hosting the Secretary General. Home Thoughts returned 2 photographs I found on Photo Booth, one's called Cheetah. And the description about this photography is that each of these new series reflects Suleyman's conviction that, as he once told an interviewer, a photographer never makes an actual subject, they just steal the image from the world. Photography, he says, is a time machine in a way to preserve the memory, to preserve time. And the other photograph is the bust of Patroclus, courtesy of the Paul Getty Museum, again from Photo Booth. Political reflections. I too like this photograph of Pope Francis and President Obama greeting each other. I really think a great deal of this Pope. I think he's tremendous. I like what he says. I like how he says it. I like him. I think he's an incredibly powerful personality. The private meeting between President Obama and Pope Francis had been scheduled to run for half an hour. It lasted 52 minutes. The president had been escorted into the Vatican by a line of Swiss guards dressed in purple and yellow, wearing helmets and carrying pole arms. The cameras clicked as the president and the pontiff shook hands, and then they sat at a small wooden table in the papal library, exchanging greetings through translators. "It's wonderful to be here," Obama said. "I'm a great admirer. Thank you so much for receiving me," Francis answered. "Thank you." Turkey has blocked access to YouTube amid national security concerns. I'll put up a photograph I found on The Guardian of a man trying to get connected to YouTube with his tablet at a cafe in Istanbul on Thursday. A leaked audio recording of a high-profile meeting of top Turkish officials has emerged today, with the officials discussing using their sovereignty over an Ottoman tomb as a pretext for a military invasion of northern Syria. Officials did not dispute the authenticity of the audio, but rather railed against YouTube for its publication of the leak and against the opposition Gulen movement, which they accused of posting it. The tomb of Suleyman Shah is in the middle of northern Syria, but is considered Turkish territory under the 1921 Treaty of Ankara. The territory is now under control of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is demanding Turkey withdraw its troops from the tomb. The audio leak involved officials discussing invading AKI soil, arguing they could spin it as defensive. I'll put up a photograph of the tomb that the Turkish officials were discussing entering Syria to defend. An operation against ISIL, the radical jihadist group Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, has international legitimacy. We will define it as Al-Qaeda. There are no issues on the Al-Qaeda framework. A voice presented that of Foreign Ministry Under Secretary says, when it comes to the Suleyman Shah tomb, it's about the protection of national soil. Erdogan confirmed the leak. They even leaked a national security meeting. He told a crowd of supporters, this is villainous, this is dishonesty. Who are you serving by doing audio surveillance of such an important meeting? And they've then blocked YouTube. When asked about justification for an incursion into Syria, intelligence chief Hakan Fidan allegedly responded, justification can be created. The matter is to create the will. Ironically, over the last 3 years, it is Ankara that has allowed Al-Qaeda-linked jihadists and weapons to flow into Syria as a way to influence the country's civil war. So it's interesting developments, and it's interesting insight into the way of thinking of the Turkish government under Erdogan. The separatist card that Russia has been playing in Crimea could trigger unease in China. I've been talking about that for a while. Rulers in China consider the breakaway feelings going through the Chinese autonomous regions of Tibet and Xinjiang as the most dangerous challenge to the country's internal stability and security, not to mention the prospect that Taiwan, a rebel province in Beijing's view, holds a referendum on independence from the mainland in the future. And that was what I was referring to previously, that it is a geopolitical enigma, this referendum that's been held in Crimea, because whilst it encourages the Russians to expand in order to protect their people, it also, if extrapolated, would mean the entire periphery around China would want to spin off. I call it the madman theory. Haldeman recalled of the president telling him, I want the North, and this is Nixon, I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip the word to them that, for God's sake, you know Nixon is obsessed about communism. We can't refrain him when he's angry and he has his hand on the nuclear button. And Ho Chi Minh himself will be in Paris in 2 days, begging for peace. Charlie Robertson, whom I interviewed, he's the author of The Fastest Billion, and I interviewed him last year on the sidelines of the Kenya Takeoff Conference, tweeted that Putin's approval is up from 61% in January to 82% right now. Obama is at 44%. I saw this photograph posted by Hassan Rouhani of him being welcomed by Hamid Karzai, which shows that the Iranians are moving at some speed and trying to consolidate support in their position. The search for the jet, the MH370, has shifted as lead indicates shorter path. The 3-week hunt for Malaysian airline 370 focused on a new area in the Indian Ocean today after radar data indicated the plane probably flew a shorter distance than earlier estimated. The new lead was based on analysis of radar data as the plane flew between the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority said in a statement, it showed the Boeing 777 travelled faster than previously estimated, using more fuel, and may not have gone as far as south as earlier thought. And I return to Thomas Pynchon's Bleeding Edge, where he said, and I think it refers to this entire narrative around this plane, no matter how the official narrative turns out, these are the places we should be looking, not in newspapers or television, but at the margins, graffiti, uncontrolled utterances, bad dreamers who sleep in public and scream in their sleep. The point being, I don't think the official narrative is bringing any clarity to the situation, and I think the story is it's not clear. because there have been so many. The story of the phones ringing, which indicated that the passengers were above seawater, the story around the flight path being very low and then very high. This was not of somebody who just flew in a straight line. Moving on, I came across a story on Foreign Affairs saying we can now monitor entire ecosystems. Think of the Amazon rainforest in nearly real time, using remote sensors to map their three-dimensional structures, satellite communications to follow elusive creatures such as the jaguar and the puma, and smartphones to report illegal logging. Interesting, isn't it? Global research is asking, are Fox News, CNN and MSNBC losing the information war? You will remember Hillary Clinton's 2011 warning that the United States was losing the information war. And I think the tone, the US tone, is way too strident and singular and is essentially not progressing the US view in this much more diffuse 21st century world that we live in. I'll put up a photograph of Hillary Clinton. International markets, the IMF on Thursday offered Ukraine a bailout of up to $18 billion. So they did come through, but the conditionalities are always the thing. In explaining why the IMF conditions had been accepted, the Prime Minister, Yatsenyuk, told Parliament Ukraine was on the edge of bankruptcy and its economy might shrink by up to 10% this year without austerity measures. With the measures in place, GDP would only contract by 3%, he predicted. When he started the job last month, Yatsenyuk called his government a kamikaze administration because of the painful reforms it would undertake. The euro was 137.43 last. Its peak in March was 139.67. Dollar index 80.10, just a few bips below that key resistance level I've spoken about before. Japanese yen 102.16, Swiss franc 0.8872, the pound above 166 now at 166.22. Aussie very strong at 0.9268, that's had a very strong March. India rupee at 60.1, that's up 2.9% since December the 31st. And it touched 60.005, which was the strongest since July 30. It's rebounded 15% from a record low in August, and I think that's all about the fact that, like him or not, people think that Mr. Modi is going to win this quite conclusively, which I think as well. South Korean won 1069.15, the Real 225.92. The Real appreciated 1.9% yesterday. Biggest gain among 24 developed nation currencies tracked by Bloomberg. The Bovespa surged 3.5%. The Egyptian pound is at 696.85, where it's been for eternity. And the South African rand, 1061.06, pressing against topside resistance. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index. Really needs to get through these sorts of levels of 80.15, 80.16 around here. Euro dollar, as I said, we've had a bit of a soft patch in the euro. Concerns that the ECB might look to ease again, but I think it's probably a trading buy around here. Dollar yen 102.16, I'll put up a 3-month chart of that as well. Gold, now below 1300 at 1295.545, has lost 7% in 9 sessions, and I, for one, think the 2014 high is in. Crude oil is now above 100, above 101 at 101.55. I'm looking to position a short sell on it. It's had a strong session, gained $1.02 yesterday. Prices up 2.1% this week and 3.1% this quarter. Moving to Sub-Saharan Africa, Nick Terse, who writes Tom Dispatch and spends a lot of time looking at the US military presence in Africa, has written another piece. After years in the shadows, US Navy SEALs emerged in a big way with the 2011 night raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Afterward, they were lauded in print as supermen fated by the president and praised by the First Lady. Soon some of the country's most secretive and elite special operators were taking the big screen by storm with 2012's blockbuster Zero Dark 30, in a film starring actual Navy SEALs' act of valor. Last year, yet another Hollywood smash, Captain Phillips, featured heroic SEALs. This time the elite mariners weren't slipping into a compound in Pakistan or some crazy global quest, but killing pirates off the coast of Africa, the location was telling. In recent years, as stories of SEAL exploits have bubbled up into the news, the operations of America's secret military have been on an exponential growth spurt, with yet more funding provided in future Pentagon budgets. And a major focus of their activities has been Africa. In 2012, for example, SEALs carried out a hostage rescue mission in Somalia. Last fall, word of a SEAL mission to that country hit the news after a bid to kidnap a terror suspect went south, and the Americans were driven off under heavy fire. That same night, Army Delta Force commandos successfully captured a Libyan militant in a night raid. A few months later, 3 or 4 SEALs conducting an evacuation mission in South Sudan were wounded when the aircraft they were flying in was hit by small arms fire. And just recently, SEALs were again in the news, this time for capturing an oil tanker with cargo from Libya that the weak US-backed government there considered stolen. By all accounts, SEAL missions in Africa are on the rise, and the Navy's special operators are far from alone. Last year, according to AFRICOM Commander General David Rodriguez, the US military carried out a total of 546 activities on the continent, a catch-all term for everything the military does in Africa. In other words, it averages about 1.5 missions a day. This represents a 217% increase in operations, programs, and exercises since the command was established in 2008. And he's great for backing up, my basic thesis. Since its inception, the US African Command has consistently downplayed its role on the continent. Meanwhile, far from the press or the public, the officers running its secret operations have privately been calling Africa the battlefield of tomorrow, today. After years in the dark, we now know just how extremely active, to use General Rodriguez's phrase, AFRICOM has been, and how rapidly the tempo of its missions has increased. It remains to be seen just what else we don't know about US Africa Command's exponentially expanding operations, he asked. I take you back to something I wrote some time ago. So I said, taking a broader sweep, it is clear that the United States and US Africa Command has carved out a much more forward position on the African continent. In some respects, Barack Obama's pivot to Asia detours through Africa. China has made a parabolic advance across the continent, and one of the desired side effects of staunching the Al-Qaeda advance is that it also counters the Chinese advance via the insertion of US hard power. The US cannot challenge China's extreme dollar diplomacy, but it can insert hard power with which it can tilt the African pitch. Now, returning to Africa, and although US Africa Command was set up under a previous president's watch, I think the penny dropped to rate China's extraordinary surge in Africa only quite recently, or in the last 24 months. Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom I admire and I believe is a foreign policy eminence grise and has Barack Obama's ear, and I suspect was one of the architects of the Ukraine situation, once said that the 3 grand imperatives, and this is fabulous, of imperial geostrategy are to prevent collusion, maintain security dependence among the vassals, to keep tributaries pliant and protected, and to keep the barbarians from coming together. There you go. I think the interesting point is how Africa has now become front and center of the geopolitical global puzzle and the collision between US hard power and China's soft power. Then jumping from there, of course, I've been talking about it for a while, but I said, sine qua non of President Obama's pivot to Asia is US NATO power projection over the Indian Ocean. That's all because of the amount of oil and gas that's going to be supplied into Asia. If you are the gatekeeper of that, you're in a very powerful position. On that note, I'll put up a picture of the setting sun taken in Lamu. If China sneezes, Africa can catch a cold. This is the World Bank. I've mentioned that previously and severally. 5 countries, Angola, South Africa, the DRC, the Republic of Congo, and Equatorial Guinea, account for about 75% of the subcontinent's exports to China. I like this sub-Saharan selfie taken in the Samburu by a fellow called Harry Hook. The South African all share is up 3.42% in 2014, came off a little bit yesterday. Dollar Rand, I'm putting up a 3-month chart of that. That's a 10.6230. We're at the top end of the range that we've been in for a while. If it breaks through this level, we could run up quite sharply towards 10. Egyptian pound, 696.63. We've been here forever. The Egyptian stock market up 22.5% this year. came off 2.7% yesterday. The Nigerian all-share is down 6.52% this year, but what's really holding up that index is the Dangote cement, which is about 1/3 of the market cap. That's gained 51% in a year versus the 13% gain in the Nigeria Stock Exchange. They reported strong profits and talking about investing $1 billion on plant expansion this year. The Ghana Stock Exchange is up 11.52% this year. I like this photograph of the sunset in Mozambique I'm going to share with you. And there's a story about how North Korea has bagged $5 million for building 2 Mugabe statues, which I thought was quite fun. Moodys, the Kenya budget deficit won't fall. Moodys believes Kenya is unlikely to reduce its budget deficit in the short term because of huge spending on wages and devolution. Moodys says that the deficit will remain at about 9% of the GDP, even with the recent reforms in value-added tax. The government's projections regarding the impact of the VAT increase may also prove overly optimistic, which would leave the deficit at about the expected level of 9%, so the Moodys report. I'm not sure. I think VAT has outperformed expectations. In point of fact, Kenya has a B1 rating with a stable outlook. Moodys notes several vulnerabilities such as the fiscal and current account deficits. The Treasury expects the spending to GDP ratio to decline, thereby narrowing the budget deficit, but Moodys says it is actually bound to rise. We think it is more likely that the spending ratio will continue to rise towards 35% of GDP in 2014-2015, and that it will remain sticky at those levels given the pressures emanating from the public sector wages and potential for spending overruns related to the decentralization of government. Spending on transport infrastructure would also put pressure on the deficit. As a consequence, the deficit is not likely to narrow as much as predicted in the MTEF. Rather, we would expect the deficit to stay at around 9%. Saying the government has embarked on an ambitious and costly effort to expand the transport network, for which the government intends to issue its first Eurobond in the near future. And this is the interesting point they're making. We expect that the government lacks capacity to raise investment spending as much as it has been predicted. Important point, and I think they're right. That's a concern. The President yesterday delivered his State of the Nation speech, and it was carried live by Al Jazeera. I'll put up a photograph I took. Made many comments. Too struck out half a century after our independence. We will live by the ideals of our founding fathers. We will not be intimidated by threats to our sovereignty, which will be met with our full might, he said. So we learned last year, security anywhere in our region is a promise of insecurity everywhere. He's referring to Somalia. Social media was seriously underwhelmed by this speech. And a great deal of goodwill that the President carried when he came into the presidency has been eroded. I, for one, think the President should have chopped some heads a long time ago just to have asserted his authority. Gafler reported a little while back that Radio Africa had sold a stake in the business. They've actually sold 49%, I believe. This report was the first to notify that such a transaction was on the horizon, but I think the numbers they've got are incorrect. KenGen's cash haul on hold pending beef-up talks. They've postponed the rights issue for another month. They're waiting to see whether the government is going to take up its rights. KenGen share price has been struggling in the face of that potential rights issue. It's down 14.3911% this year, and reported first half profits which were considerably behind the previous first half. The link is on Rich Wrap-Ups if you want to have a look. The Nairobi all-share up 5.7811%. Just a smidgen off a record high. The NSE 20 up 0.81%. Once again, I do appreciate the fact that you stopped by. I hope to see you at Mindspeak tomorrow if you have the time. Intercontinental Nairobi, breakfast from 3:30. From 9:30. Once again, thank you for stopping by.